Beautiful. Lise, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thanks, Liz. First and foremost, a few simple community agreements just to make sure everyone's on the same page. We are going to ask that folks save questions until the end. And at the end, um, if you have a question, feel free to use the raise hand reaction in Zoom as a way to indicate, hey, I would like some attention. There is also a link that we'll put over in the chat as well. So if you have a question that you don't want to have yourself associated with for whatever reason, feel free to use that form. We'll be checking in on that regularly so that we can bring up those questions. And we will be sending out resources, including answers to questions after the event. Please try to keep the microphone muted if you're not speaking, just so that we can cut down on background noise and keep a little bit of focus on the speakers and the message today. And we ask that because we do only have an hour, keep questions limited to the topic at hand. We are going to be talking about HIV and criminalization around HIV, not other things associated with HIV, not other infectious diseases. And we are going to be using a ouch, oops, and educate model. So if you hear something that pops up, feel free to either in the chat or raising your hand say, ouch, that hurts. Or if you recognize that you said something a little bit off as the or during the time that you're speaking, just a quick oops. In either case, we can address those things and move on so that we're not distracting too much from the flow, but still allowing people time and grace to learn together in this space. Next one. My name's Lise Regula here with Ohio Equal Rights. I'll be doing the verbal side of facilitation today, asking our wonderful panelists about HIV, criminalization, what can be done, what's the current status, and so on, alongside my colleague Liz. Go right ahead.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Liz. I use they, them, or she, her pronouns. Um, I am, uh, I didn't even think about how I would describe my age, but I am a relatively young appearing, um, as I like to think, white feminine presenting person, although femme really in a old school Peter Pan kind of way. Um, and my background is blurred because I am in the middle of helping some folks move. So you should have a blurred background. I have short hair, a nose ring, as well as an industrial piercing. I'm really excited to see everyone here today. I am both with Ohio Equal Rights. I'm part of their leadership team, but I'm also part of the Ohio National Lawyers Guild, which is co-hosting this with us. So I am the field organizer, and if anyone would like to volunteer with either organization or would like LOs or know your rights trainings, please feel free to ask. If you put them in the chat, that would be great. Or you can email us afterwards. Um, and then I'll hand it back over to Lise and our panelists. Yeah, thank you, Lise. LO is legal observer.
Thanks, Liz. And I forgot to do the visual description. Middle-aged, pasty white guy, short light hair, very boring, and I'm okay with that. You might see my buttons from League of Women Voters where I was earlier today. And on to our panelists. Kim, if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kim Welter. I'm a femme presenting white woman in my 60s with white hair, and my background is just white. Fortunately, my hair and the background are different shades of white. Um, I am the facilitator for the Ohio Health Modernization Movement, and I facilitate as part of my role at Equality Ohio Education Fund. My bio will be in the notes. We don't need to go through all of that.
Thanks, Kim. Maya?
Good afternoon, y'all. My name is Maya Simek. I use she for pronouns. I'm a white presenting femme woman who is in her mid 40s, and I have two nose piercings and a nose hoop, a blurred background, and a black tattoo that is poking off my shoulder as we are looking. I am coming to you as the director of the Human Trafficking Law Clinic at Case Western and a legal consultant at Equality Ohio, and I'm excited to be here.
Thanks, Maya. And Sydney.
Hello, I'm Sydney. I use she, they pronouns. I'm an LASWS independent social worker in the state of Ohio. I'm a white cisgender femme presenting woman. I have dark brown hair and dark eyes. My hair is about shoulder length. I don't know how to blur my background. So you do see my office space. Behind me is a white wall that has framed license and my diplomas, and a brown door. I do have a septum piercing and a nostril piercing. I currently work at Orion White program at UTMC in Toledo. Today I am representing just myself, so anything that I say is just my own personal or professional opinion or experience, but I am speaking with that background.
All right. Thank you so much. And those extended bios with all of the amazing stuff about our presenters will be in the packet arriving via email after this. So first off, if you could give us a little bit of the current lay of the land around laws criminalizing HIV in Ohio and at the federal level.
I think I can jump in on this. Is the map next? And if so, move to it. Yeah. So this is just a map showing what kinds of laws exist in various states. Ohio is one of the worst. We have, in a minute, we'll talk about it. We actually have 6 statutes that criminalize HIV, as well as a sex offender registry for some of those offenses. So I think we can move on. There we are. All 6 of the laws. So the first 3 are all related to sex work, solicitation, loitering, and prostitution. And we're going to talk about these in more detail. The harassment with a bodily substance, which for people living with HIV actually extends to the general public, not just law enforcement. And then the 2 that actually are only apply to people living with, the first 4 apply to, you could be arrested as anyone for those things, but the final 2 are really just for people living with. The felonious assault is the one we're most commonly familiar with, where they criminalize people who, let's just face it, can't prove they disclosed their status prior to being intimate. And then selling or donating contaminated blood or blood products. Pretty self-explanatory, but we're going to talk about each one a little bit more detail, so we can move on to the next slide. All right, as we mentioned, 4 of these statutes just add an extra penalty if you happen to be a person living with. So we have solicitation, basically when you're exchanging sex for something of value, or offering to. So the important part here is to realize that we're talking about talking, right? That there's no physical activity, no physical sexual contact or anything. We're just talking about talking. And so if you are a person living with, what would typically be a misdemeanor becomes a felony. So you can go on to the next slide. Yeah, so it just gives you an example of what people face. If it's the misdemeanor and you're not living with HIV, that's 60 days in jail, max time, and a fine of $500. But if you happen to be a person living with, then it becomes a 3rd-degree felony, max time of 1 to 5 years, and a fine of $10,000. It is an incredible upcharge on these. And it doesn't, when you're just talking, as we mentioned, there is no risk of transmission in solicitation. Okay, moving on to the next one. Loitering to engage in solicitation. So this one we actually, well, anecdotally, we know is kind of used more often than the others. You can see the description of what counts as loitering briefly. Talking to strangers in public, essentially, or what appear to be strangers in public. Go on to the next slide. I'm trying to move fast because we got a lot to cover in this short period of time. So again, the penalties is what we want to see here. Well, if you are not a person living with HIV, this could be as a misdemeanor, max time of 60 days in jail, and a fine of $500. If you are living with HIV, and again, loitering is again standing around, talking to people maybe, and there's no risk of transmission in this behavior, none. But if you're a person living with, it becomes a 5th degree felony, max time is 6 to 12 months, and a fine of $2,500. Okay, we can go on. Prostitution, this one is the actual act. However, it doesn't take into account what we know today about the science of HIV and how HIV is spread and what kinds of activities are actually highly likely to transmit HIV. Sexual activity and sexual conduct, sexual contact are all, and Maya, step in and correct me if I'm wrong here, but are defined in rape law. And so they're extremely broadly defined for all kinds of activity, a lot of which cannot transmit HIV, especially if the person is untransmittable. We'll talk about this in a minute. Untransmittable, or they're engaging in activity that has a low risk of transmission. Go on to the next slide. The penalties here, if you were so misdemeanor for a person not living with HIV. If you're living with HIV, it becomes a 3rd degree felony, 1 to 5 years, and a fine of $10,000. Right. And I kind of said all the rest of it. Then we move on to the harassment with a bodily substance. This is the one where we think about, spitting on a cop, generally, when we're thinking about this. But for people living with, this now applies outside of law enforcement as well. So anyone could charge a person living with harassment with a bodily substance. And there has to be an intention to annoy, harass, threaten, or alarm the other person. What might be alarming to one person may not be alarming to another person. So this gets kind of interesting, but it includes things that don't transmit HIV, like spitting, or I hate to say this, but like urine. These aren't going to transmit HIV. I think I've said what we need to say about this one. We find is used the most often is the harassment with a bodily substance. Again, you can look at the differential in the penalties if you're not living with HIV versus if you are living with HIV. And again, does not take into account any actual risk of transmission, intent to transmission, use of prevention methods, or any of the current science. This is the one we're most familiar with. Felonious assault. This is actually subsection B for those of you who are more lawyery than others. So we're talking particularly about subsection B. And then the other one that only applies to people living with HIV is the selling or donating contaminated blood. So I'll tell you what I mean a little bit more about that, but let's go on to the next slide, which I believe is going to be the felonious assault. Yes, so felonious assault, subsection B, is if you are someone living with HIV and you know that you are living with HIV, which becomes important in determining whether you can be charged or not. If you have not disclosed your HIV status before engaging in intimate behaviors, anything that can be defined under sexual conduct or sexual contact in Ohio Revised Code, which I mentioned is very, very broadly defined. What we see in reality is that the problem is being able to prove you disclosed. A story after story of people who were living together, had a relationship. The one knew, the other at some point at least knew the one person was living with HIV. They stay together, and then the relationship ends, and one brings charges against the other. It's just repeated stories of this happening. So there's the element of when you disclose, the person you are speaking to, you as the person living with, must be able to determine whether they can understand the significance of your HIV status. As one of my favorite grassroots advocates, Brian Jones, who has since passed on, used to say, it does not take into account whether the person living with HIV understands the significance of their status. So it doesn't take that into account at all. Actually, can you go back to the one before for a minute? Yeah. And also, just engaging in sexual conduct or contact with someone who is under 18, whether you disclose or not, can get you in trouble with this particular statute. All right, now you can move on. So what counts? You can read through that description at your leisure if you'd like. Again, the thing to know is that this is how sex or intimate contact is defined in rape law. So it's extremely broad. Okay, we can move on to the next one. I don't need to go through all of those. So the penalties. This is a second-degree felony, 2 to 8 years per occurrence. So I know a gentleman who had sex with a woman 5 times, and he's serving 40 years. Right, so they're cumulative. They can be cumulative. And a fine of $15,000. There's also a sex offender registry attached to this statute. So, you know, it's a lifetime of, or the length of the registration effect. So it's not just in jail, but it's afterwards, and everything that goes with being on a sex offender registry. And let's just face it, everything that goes with having a felony on your record as well. So the problems with the law, again, doesn't matter whether you transmitted HIV, doesn't matter whether you intended to transmit HIV. You may have told the other person, but if you can't prove it, that, you know, your word isn't going to matter. We often tell people, you know, a lot of people sign contracts, but we also say, take your person to your physician with you. And in the room where the doctor has documented that your intimate partner, your soon to be, because it should be soon to be, not already, soon to be an intimate partner was in the room and heard you discussing your status. We have seen somebody escape a charge like this because their doctor was able to testify to that. All right. I think that's, yeah. And again, it puts the burden on the person living with to determine whether the person they're disclosing to is capable. So this does become a problem at 2 a.m. in a bar. Let's just face it. All right, and we can go on to the next one. All right, so what do we want to do? So the Ohio Health Modernization Movement, or OHMM for short, thinks that repealing all 6 is probably not realistic in Ohio, but we would like to repeal the 5 of them. We didn't talk much about blood and blood products, but we don't see that being used in Ohio. The Red Cross and the plasma centers all test every donation thoroughly. If you test positive for any of the variety of things besides HIV as well, test positive, you go into a registry, computerized registry, and if you try to go somewhere else, they will defer you also and not accept your donation. So the Red Cross plasma centers do not count on this law to shield anybody from a donation that might have HIV, syphilis, or any of the things that they screen for. So the law is kind of useless anyway. So we want to repeal all of the laws I mentioned, the 5 laws that I mentioned, except for felonious assault. And for felonious assault, we would like to require that there be an actual physical harm, so that somebody who's not transmitted HIV, so that if somebody who is not living with HIV couldn't bring one of these charges. And then there has to be some sort of intent to transmit. And intent gets proven by if you take precautions, like you're untransmittable, which we know that if your viral load is under 200 count, we know from testing you cannot transmit sexually. So, maybe you're undetectable. The other person's on PrEP. You are used a condom. You weren't engaged in activity that actually transmit HIV, but you were taking some sort of precaution. Then you can't have intended to transmit. So those are the things that we would like to do. We'd also like to make it a misdemeanor. There is public health code already that makes it a misdemeanor to not tell your intimate partner you have any communicable disease. So that already exists. So we'd like to put it back on the same level as that. Is that likely? Probably not, but that would be our preference. All right. So requiring a state of mind, that's intent. Take into consideration risk reduction measures. You didn't intend to, you took precautions. Remove the HIV specific felonies on the 5. Require proof of transmission, so only a person already living with HIV could bring a charge. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah, just remove the penalty enhancements for sex workers. The harassment with a bodily substance law also, besides HIV, also includes tuberculosis and Hep C. And so that's what we would, like to see there'd be no upcharge for anyone. And remove the requirement to register as a sex offender unless there was transmission and there was intent to transmit. And remove the donation penalties. So that's what we'd like to see this change to. I'm going to also put in the chat the Ohio Health Modernization Movement's website, where you can find all kinds of information about this, but I'll just put it in the chat right now. Okay, next slide. Maya, is this where you want to jump in with me on these? Or do you want me to keep going for a while?
I think that we are pinging this one to Sydney.
We're
Yeah.
going to what? Oh, no, we are? Excellent. Okay.
Yeah, so Lise, did you want to read the question, or would you like me to just start?
Go ahead and start.
Sure. So in this slide, in this section, we wanted to talk about how it's impacting Ohio and the broad community. Some of the things that I'll mention were mentioned previously, but I'll touch on them again. So I do work in direct care, so I think my perspective is maybe a little bit different, and that's where I'm speaking from. And then I believe Maya was going to talk a little bit about public outing after I do my little thing. So Kim had mentioned that most of these laws were put into place when we really didn't know a whole lot. It was very scary. HIV and AIDS were still considered a death sentence. And so that state of fear is where most of these laws were introduced. I am a person, as a social worker, I like to assume innocence and good intentions as much as I can. I do think the older I get, the harder it is, and maybe become a little bit more on the cynical side. But if we take a look at these laws and we assume innocence and good intentions, we can recognize that the purpose of these laws are to prevent HIV transmission, to protect the rights and safety of others in our communities, to promote disclosure, and to prevent someone from maliciously attempting to transmit HIV to others. So I'd like to think that when these things were put into place, these are the things that we were trying to do. So unfortunately, the laws, there's no research that says the laws do any of these things. So they do not decrease transmission of HIV. These laws are not considered an evidence-based intervention. As Kim mentioned, many of the laws, the actions that are included in the laws don't actually pose any real threat. Things like spitting, sexual contact with a toy, oral sex, asterisks, it's negligible. I don't think there are any documented cases. Sex with a condom, all of these different things, the loitering, most of these things don't have any actual risk of transmission. She mentioned that the blood products are already routinely screened. And she also mentioned the fact that the laws do not currently require intent. and puts the onus of responsibility of proving disclosure on the person living with HIV. So what do these laws do? How do they actually impact us in our communities? So the CDC reports, and we know that these laws de-incentivize testing. So with all of these laws, if you know that you're living with HIV, then you can be charged with the laws or the charges. So if you don't know that you're living with HIV, then you don't have the risk of having these charges brought against you. So it actually de-incentivizes getting tested and knowing your status. When it comes to intimate partner violence or domestic violence, it allows for the perpetuation of coercive control. We have seen where the perpetrator or abuser will threaten to bring charges to say, you didn't tell me, or to out their status to other people that could potentially bring charges. And so often folks that are in mixed status relationships in this way, people will be fearful to leave relationships, to receive services to protect themselves for fear of having these felony charges brought against them. It also decreases the comfort and protection for people making reports or interacting with the police. So we know a lot of the folks that we serve don't wish to interact with the police, which is also fine. But for folks that may need to for whatever reason, it makes that interaction more risky and less safe. In my professional work, this is a reason that I am very vocal and attempt to avoid involving the police in our clinic space or contacting the police to interact with our patients as much as possible. When we have new staff come in, they can sometimes be a little bit more quick to involve police in crisis situations or in like mandated reporting scenarios or safety checks. And we know that each time there's that interaction, especially if police officers were for any reason being hostile or combative, sometimes we've had people say that, or I've heard of cases where people have just spoken very angrily and spit has flown and that bodily substance charge has come about when they really weren't doing anything wrong or intending any harm. I had a person who the police were responding with the ambulance after a suicide attempt. And fortunately, nothing came of it, but there were some questions of whether police officers were going to bring charges based on blood that they came into contact with, not intentionally because it was after a suicide attempt. So we know that I imagine a lot of folks in this room don't necessarily see law enforcement as people who protect us. I also hold that belief, but in instances where they are called and that is their role, it puts folks living with HIV at greater risk of discrimination and charges coming against them just for living with the condition that they have.
Thank you, Sydney. And this is for all of our panelists. How does HIV affect community members who live at the intersection of multiple marginalized communities?
Absolutely. So I'll jump in first on this one. And so coming at you from the lens of someone who works as both a social worker and an attorney with folks who have engaged in sex work and or who also have experienced human trafficking. And so I want to just like particularly talk about some of the laws and also some of the ways we're seeing this dualistic presentation of, hey, we're doing a sting, and the sting is supposed to be to combat human trafficking, right? And what actually has happened is we're seeing a very disparate impact, both on people who are living with HIV and people who are being trafficked, still getting charged and alerted in very public spaces around their HIV status during some of these mechanisms, such as stings. So if we can go to the next slide, what we've actually done is I just wanted to show you some of the articles that have been presented across the state of Ohio. And I just did a simple Google search. There are many more than this, but the first slide talks about someone who was working to engage in the solicitation of sex, was trying to engage in the purchase of a sexual act, but they outed the person's HIV status in their purchasing of the sexual act. And there is information about this person online that is readily accessible, right? So again, we have the outing of someone's HIV status that is being used very publicly when we're seeing these stings come into fruition. And it talks a lot about the person's identity, where they're located, and a lot of other disclosable public information that is going to see, undoubtedly, and through our experience and conversation with folks, a lot of discrimination for the person trying to move through the world after the release of this information. On the next slide, you will see also we are seeing folks that are posited as being helped or assisted by some of these sting mechanisms. And this picture or this article in particular is from 2024, and they actually post the photo of the human that was then charged with this offense. I refuse to repost that photo. I don't think it's helpful. I think it's actually really upsetting and insulting, but I did want to show like a couple of the things that we're seeing happen. So this human was someone who was actually reported to be a survivor of human trafficking, step one. Step two, they're using languaging around the fact that this person is prostituting, which charged language, not accurate, and actually has a lot of stigma to it. And step three, they did post this person's picture on it. And so there is a lot going on here. This woman is also a woman of color and a woman who is transgender. And so like the level of intersectional identities that are outed with this news article tends to be something that we are watching with alarming concern. Because again, now you have something that is online that has identified your private information under the guise of something that is supposed to be helping in society, which that is an entirely different conversation that we can go in at another time. But right, so if this is meant to be helping or assisting people, and at the end, what we're doing is charging folks or looking to charge folks under these antiquated laws, then what we're doing is just like perpetuating ways in which people are unable to get out of the stigmatized role that we're placing them into with some of these situations, and the ongoing law that is impacting folks. As a side note, the other thing that's important to go back to a little bit about what Kim and Sydney were talking about, when we talk about some of the ways these laws are instituted, as an attorney, I'll tell you the ways in which someone is soliciting someone or what loitering looks like can be as much as like gesturing on a street curb, particularly in areas where police officers tend to frequent the location more. And so where are police officers going? Who are they targeting? What does it look like? And who are they going to be trying to make an analysis of how their determination for a solicitation looks is going to be under a lot of bias, under a lot of scrutiny, and in places where police officers are trying to look for something being wrong, which tends to be communities of color, communities with lower socioeconomic status, and communities where perhaps sex work is being engaged in by folks in that area, right? And so again, the perpetuation of who is actually falling into these different scenarios is going to be disproportionately impacting Black, Brown, and members of the LGBTQ community. So just wanted to bring some of that to this collective conversation as well.
I have a quick comment. So we also know that all the groups that Maya listed are disproportionately impacted by HIV and also by the carceral system that we have. So if you've read the book, what is it, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, they focus very heavily on the war on drugs and what a felony charge does to a person, essentially creates a second-class citizen within our country. So when someone has a felony charge on their record, it negatively impacts their ability to find housing, negatively impacts their ability to apply for jobs. And so there's a lot of ways that just having a felony charge can impact the way that you move throughout our society and the way that you are viewed. In that book, they also talk about how frequently prosecutors will scare folks into taking plea bargains. So they do end up with a felony charge that they may have not had they actually gone through the court system. So that book, like I said, speaks specifically on the war on drugs, but pretty much everything they say other than the specific laws around like food stamps, SNAP benefits, those are specific to drug charges, but everything else that a felony on your background is going to impact is also an impact there. And then if you add the sex offender status registry on top of that, for anybody who's ever worked with someone, finding housing is almost impossible. And almost always automatically puts people back into neighborhoods where they're likely to have more interactions with police, and, you know, back maybe relapsing on substances or whatever it might be. So that felony status is a big deal. And so I think the talk around making some of these charges or one of these charges to be a misdemeanor would significantly impact the outcome that these laws would have on people.
I love it. And to jump in as well, getting these articles taken down is next to impossible. And so we strive to work with folks so that a Google search is not going to out you when you're applying for jobs and for employment. And that is at the personal discretion of the news site that is posting the article. And so we have had super limited success with some places taking them down and super adverse outcomes with newspapers who are telling us that we're running afoul of like a First Amendment right that they have to disclose the truths as they so see, even if the use of the language is charged or inaccurate or harmful. And so that is the other side of this. Aside from whether or not it can be removed from your criminal record, the fact that a Google search that's accessible to anyone by looking up your name will kind of like what's up stays up kind of mentality is also very important to recognize.
Thank you. And I know a lot of folks on this call and all of our panelists know that we're at a point where a lot of people are tired because there are fires to be put out everywhere. Considering this, why is it still important to keep a focus on addressing HIV criminalization and working towards removing some of those or all of those discriminatory statutes?
I can jump in real quick with our reason. One of our reasons is that if we want to end the epidemic, right, and it's still an epidemic, the way we end the epidemic is we get everyone tested, everyone who needs it on medication, as many people as possible undetectable, and then we diminish transmissions this way. And as Sydney mentioned, this is the existence of these laws is a disincentive to getting tested. All of the end the epidemic plans in Ohio, which are for Cincinnati, Columbus, and Cleveland, those counties include that we must modernize the criminal code in order to end the epidemic. So that's one reason.
Yeah, so when I was thinking about this question, because I imagine a lot of people on this call do care about a lot of things, which is great, but can also make this work very difficult. So when I tell people what I do for a living, I usually get two responses. I either get, oh, that's so sad, or, oh, that's still a thing. So what that tells me is that HIV was once a highly focused on condition or concern within our communities, and that the broader community has essentially forgotten. I do think there are pockets of society, especially like the LGBTQ community or the BIPOC communities, that might be a little bit more aware. But unfortunately, because HIV isn't a death sentence, we have so much good science and interventions around it. It's kind of a forgotten issue. And I talk to a lot of people. So when I get either that's still a thing or that's so sad, that tells me that there are a lot of folks that maybe aren't thinking about this. So I'm also a proponent of do what you can when you can, and don't be too hard on yourself if this isn't something that you can take on. But even just the little bits of information that you learned today, and maybe you share that with someone else, we can make really big change with just those small movements.
I agree to both of those points. And then on the next slide, I also say, so we had conducted through Equality Ohio and the Williams Institute and a whole bunch of wonderful volunteers, like that is 50 plus, I think, a study of the actual convictions around some of these laws to see like who is being impacted. And the Buckeye Flame did an amazing article, and I'm putting the actual report in the chat for your review as well. But some of the key findings of this report continue to show us and conclude like the people that are being impacted the most by these laws are folks from marginalized communities and that continue to hold intersectional identities that are being targeted. And we can see it in the ways in which the outcomes were manifested. And so we see that generally speaking, in different county by county areas, like moving through the world as a person living with HIV is going to be inherently more dangerous because certain places are prosecuting more than other places. So for example, Cuyahoga County was the top. And so if you are in Cuyahoga County and you are a person living with HIV, your likelihood of being unsafe moving through the world and gesturing, right, is something that we are trying to take note of. And of course, as we already discussed, but what was shown in our conviction reports is that people who are Black and people who are getting charged and actually convicted with these offenses are disproportionately demonstrated. And so 36% of the cases that we saw were individuals who identified as Black. But you know that if you look at the state, for example, the state demographics in Ohio right now, about 13.4% identify as Black within the state as a whole. And so you can break it down for a county by county kind of dissection. But overall, like we just know it to be true that people who are moving through the world are impacted differently if they are presenting as someone who appears to be a non-white individual. With 68%, for example, in Cuyahoga County are being impacted were people who identified as Black. And so I think it's important for us to note, right? So there's the carceral system and how people move through it and what kind of representation you get and who's being charged. But then again, it's also the people that are being targeted for looking into these offenses from the first place. And so I feel like that is a compelling reason as well. We cannot rest in order to move forward, to know that people are moving through the world and being inherently unsafe, and the lack of safety is extending into an upcharge of felonious offenses that are keeping people trapped in the system, the carceral system, with a lot of disparate impact.
Thank you. And since we've been so efficient, if you'll forgive me, I want to pipe in. I do have another hat working as advocacy associate with men having babies, and the work that y'all are doing to continue working towards that decriminalization helps us to make the case to providers who are more in that lived or more on the side of impacting lived equality. It's helpful for us to push back against some of their policies now that more people are saying, hey, this needs to change. These are discriminatory laws. So thank you from my work. Last question for our panelists. What do professionals supporting people with HIV need to know in order to provide the best care possible?
I can start. So first, this work happens in two main ways, through education and through direct advocacy with lawmakers. So we have some options here. I work directly with patients, and so the thing that comes to mind for me is to educate patients on the state laws. It is part of our intake process to talk about these laws. It is uncomfortable, and we wish we did not have to. But I was in a training recently where they said direct is kind. So especially when we have people moving from out of state, we are very clear what could potentially happen and steps that they might take to protect themselves. I always like to say too, don't recreate the wheel. So we have someone from OHMM here who has given you the link. There are folks in the state already doing this work. Don't make it harder than it needs to be. I would also recommend looking at other states that have already been successful in this area. So Florida, through equality, Florida was able to modernize a lot of their laws. And then in Illinois and New Jersey, they were able to repeal their laws altogether. So there are models for this that have been affected. And I think, unfortunately, right now, our political state, stance, realm, however you'd like to describe it, is unfortunately very similar to Florida's. So if they can do it, we can do it. And then I like to talk about the advances in science. those people that either said, oh, that's still a thing, or that's so sad, they clearly weren't aware of what's happening. So we've talked about U equals U, undetectable equals untransmittable. We have more access to PrEP than we ever have before. But I always like to mention to be cautious of leaving folks that have detectable viral loads behind. Often when we have these conversations and we do talk about risk, which I do think is important because I don't think a lot of folks know what is actually of risk. I teach college students, and every year I ask them how they think HIV is spread, and I get spit from almost every student in class. And they're college students, they're young, they're out of high school. That's the generation that I would expect to know something different, but the message just isn't getting out there. So talk about the advances in science, but be cautious how we talk about risk, and for folks that have detectable viral loads for whatever reason, to make sure that they're not left behind in this fight.
I also love the modality of understanding clear as kind. That is one of my favorite items. And I feel like when we talk about this, talking about sex is just something that we can't shy away from. And what it is defined under the law is sex as versus what someone might hold to be true as sex, right? And so I think that is an important part of the conversation. We have to say the words like oral sex and anal sex and vaginal sex and also sex toys, right? That is part of this, that we have to say, no, your risk includes all of these things and penetration, no matter how slight, because I want you to understand the full scope of what a sexual act is defined under Ohio law. I think our job as practitioners, no matter if it's social work, law, advocate, however we stand with, is to understand that people don't get the legislation. It is inaccessible. It was created by a bunch of lawyers and people in a back room who are sitting there just trying to come up with fancy words that don't help and don't tend to translate down to like folks who are not sitting in those rooms. And so what the actual events are that can put you at risk is a very important thing. And while we're working hard, how are we translating those stories up to the legislature? How are we getting involved with OHMM and any of the different ways in which we are working to advocate for the law? But also, what are we doing to work at this time for protection? And so I am an attorney around that. I do like sex contracts because in the interim, I think they're terrible and they're offensive and they're really weird, right? But I try to say if an NBA player can do it, we need to be able to do it because at this point in time, if you can't protect yourself in any other way, then how are we going to keep folks out of the situation where being imprisoned is going to be an outcome that's possible? And so, and it can't be while high and it can't be while doing any kind of mind altering substance. And so it has to be preventive and it has to be upfront. And so again, talking about that in a way that makes that remedy possible right now to use what we have in this moment, I think is super important as well. And making it unacceptable that we are outing people in news statements. And like anytime you see one of these charged articles, like letters to the editor, comments around things like this is not the way we report news. And we do not appreciate outing people's medical conditions on news platforms, right? So that we can stop normalizing the use of someone's medical condition in a public forum. That's just not something that we should be staying complicit with and not speaking when we see it come up.
I think they got it covered.
Well, thank you all. That is some depressing but good to know information. Our last slide does have the link that's been submitted over in the chat a couple of times, and we do have a few folks who had questions during. So while people are deciding whether or not they want to raise their hand and ask something in person, we'll start out with the submissions. The first one was, do any or all of our panelists, why are the consequences so much more severe for people who live with HIV than those who do not?
I mean, I think that goes back to what we didn't know in the 1990s, early 2000s when these laws were passed. I heard the legislator who introduced the felonious assault law say on a radio interview that there was a situation in his hometown and he was asked to give law enforcement something they could. He didn't even think about it. He just borrowed language from another state, dropped it into the revised code in Ohio without looking at how it impacted, in particular, our definitions of sexual conduct and sexual contact being from rape law. They were panicked, just throwing things at the wall, and we know better now, and we can do better now.
I think that's a great response. The next question is directed towards Kim. If someone who donated blood but didn't know they were positive, could they get punished still with them not knowing?
No, they have to know. The plasma centers or the blood centers will send a letter to the address that was given at the time the donation was made. So quite often you'll see them ask, will you still be at this address for the next 8 weeks? In some of the questions they ask, and that's why. So yeah, you would have to be able to prove that you knew beforehand. But we have seen those letters, whether they're understood, whether they ever make it to the person, because mail, a little unreliable, all right, used as proof later that the person knew they were living with HIV, and that person did serve time as a result, although they said they didn't understand the letter. So
that's unfortunate, but thanks for that information, Kim. Autumn.
Sorry, the thing didn't want to go unmuted. So my question is, so why are people who live with HIV more criminalized, but then people who are rapists who actually commit horrendous crimes, how come they serve little to no prison time, but then these people who are just living their life, they get more times than an actual rapist does? And that
I
can
don't
be
want
for
to take
anyone.
that one.
Yeah, no, your point is valid. And I think your point is taken along the facts, but this is an easy conviction, is quite honest. Like if we're gonna say the thing is that the law is set up in such a way, like, are you HIV positive? Check, you are now eligible for a higher offense. Just on, it's called like on its face, it's prima facie. So like you meet the criteria, and now like there's no way around it. Like, do you have HIV and you knew? Great, I'm going to work on convicting you under this law. The way that the penalties are set up for all kinds of other sexual offense cases and mitigating circumstances, meaning like the ways in which we try to reduce someone's liability or eligibility for a conviction, it's just different. But I think cases where you're able to just charge someone for things that they're not able to combat because they're just correct, makes it an easier stance. And so going back to what Kim said is we set up this law in a fear-based time where we wanted to charge people to keep the spread of HIV going because we considered it to be a death sentence. And so anyone trying to engage in a sexual act was considered to be someone who was doing something potentially so wrong, because if you contracted HIV, then you were never ever going to get better and you were likely going to lead to death, right? That was the fear that this was based upon, and it hasn't been updated at this point in time to reflect what we know to be true now. And so those other laws that are terrible and discriminatory and impacting people in other ways, absolutely, should be conversations around updating those too. But they're just, I think, a larger scale conversation of how the legal system looks at factors of each of those offenses. But I hear you and I see you.
If we think about who is living with HIV, it's people, unfortunately, that our society has deemed as less than. So queer people, trans people, people of color, people who don't have a lot of money, people who inject drugs. And so often those folks are very easy to look at and say, you have done something wrong and malicious, that I think doesn't always happen in some of those other cases that you described, unfortunately.
Just last year, we had a judge say to the defendant, "You are a loaded gun."
That's, I wish I could say shocking, but bad no matter what. The next question, I think, is going to be the last one that we have time for and ends us on a little bit of a more positive note. How can we get involved with the work?
Well, a couple of ways. We can approach this legislatively, which we've kind of hinted at is a little bit difficult in the current day and age, right? But every opportunity you have to educate somebody else about how HIV spreads, if you have an ability to have a conversation with a local prosecutor's office, and we'll come help you with this, right? Go in and talk to them, educate them. They don't know either. Judges don't know, right? The modern science of HIV. So every opportunity you have to educate people who are in those decision-making situations is important. If you are somebody who has a particular expertise, you might be like Sydney here. If you go talk to your local legislator, particularly if they are more conservative than not. And if nothing else, educate them on how the modern science of HIV. They still understand it as a 1980s thing.
And I just want to jump in because I don't know if we covered a lot of statistics, but I remember preparing for this panel. Some of you shared with me information that I didn't even realize that and so correct me on this, that if you do nothing to protect yourself or manage your own health, you still have a very low risk of transmission, I think. And I forget which one of you mentioned that, but it was like a 25%
Yeah,
risk.
so it's around pregnancy.
Oh, go
So
ahead.
if a pregnant person takes no precaution whatsoever during the pregnancy or birthing process, the risk of vertical transmission, so parent to child through pregnancy and birthing, is 25%. And if the person is on effective medication and is under care, that goes to less than 1%. And even with injecting drugs, so if someone shares needles with another person and the first person is living with HIV and the second person isn't, each time there's an injection, it's either 1 in 260 or 1 in 280. Off the top of my head, I can't remember, but like less than 0.5% every time. So I think a lot of folks think that like if I come into contact with a drop of blood, I'm going to automatically get HIV. And the fact is, like, skin is a really great barrier, and we have so many tools for prevention. And honestly, HIV doesn't like to live outside of the body. It's actually kind of difficult for HIV transmission to occur. And I don't think that is what most people know. It's definitely not something that I knew or understood before doing this work.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Oh, thank you so much. I want to be respectful of people's time. It is 1:02, so we'll go ahead and end the questions at this point. If you think of something later, the question submission form, we are going to continue accepting answers until midnight tonight. So if you think of something over dinner this evening, feel free to enter that, and that'll the questions and answers, as well as ways to get involved and resources, will be in an email after this. So you can keep learning. And we appreciate all of your time. Kim, Maya, Sydney, thanks for sharing your wisdom with us.
Perfect. All right. And I guess if anyone wants, yeah, feel free to email us. If anyone is like looking to hang out, I don't want to promise the time of any of our wonderful panelists because they've already been very generous. But feel free to send us a message. We'll probably be on for the Zoom will run for a couple of minutes, but yeah, thank you everyone. Cool. Sydney, Kim, Maya, thank you all so much.
Thank you. Do we want to stop the Zoom recording?
Yeah, yeah, I'll stop the recording and then